Welcome to the third panel discussion of this year's Development Policy Discussion Days, titled International Cooperation in Afghanistan, a Way Forward with or Without the Taliban? My name is Susanne Neubert, and I'm the director of the Center for Rural Development at the Humboldt University Berlin. A warm welcome to the audience joining us online and to the panelists who will be introduced later. I would like to thank the participants of our postgraduate study program for organizing and moderating the panel. Patrick Ams, Laszlo Bier, Sophia Diekmann, Barbara Kurz, Leon Mariot, Janis Perzelmeier, and Anastasia Shuralova. I also thank Elena Gnant and Annika Buchholz for the coordination of the event, as well as the translators who will simultaneously translate this panel discussion into German. Yesterday, we discussed with our panel guests and the audience how a German feminist trade policy could look like. Earlier today, we examined the complex web of relations between Africa and Germany in the context of its bilateral energy partnerships, with a special focus on green hydrogen transition. I now give the word to Joost Pachali, head of the Asia division at the Heinrich Böll Foundation. He will give you some more information about today's panel on the future of the international cooperation in Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Neubert, for this introduction. I would also like to welcome you very warmly to this discussion on Afghanistan in the name of Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung. And as Dr. Neubert already mentioned, I'm Joost Pachali, and I head the Asia department here at the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Berlin. And I have a special focus working on South Asia, including Afghanistan, and have been involved in the work of the foundation in Afghanistan for many years. But let me begin by mentioning some history. For already 22 years, the Center of Rural Development has been organizing the development policy discussion days in close cooperation with Heinrich Böll Foundation. And it's a pleasure for me to say a few words here at the beginning of this panel. But before that, I would like to extend a very special and warm welcome to the speakers of this evening. Ms. Deborah Düring, she's a member of the German Bundestag. Ms. Hosna Jalil, a former Deputy Minister of Women Affairs and Interior Affairs in Afghanistan. And last but not least, Dr. Arne Strand from the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen in Norway. The Heinrich Böll Foundation has been working in Afghanistan since 2002. And as I was based in the region at this time, I had the privilege to be part of the first fact-finding mission of Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung in Afghanistan after the Taliban were defeated in 2001. Since then, the Heinrich Böll Foundation has been working in Afghanistan on various subjects like the promotion of journalism, women development, youth empowerment, but also topics like reconciliation, transitional justice, and ecology. An office of the foundation has been established in Kabul in 2006, which worked very successfully for many years. But unfortunately, this office had to be closed in 2017 due to security reasons. But after that, after 2017, we continued working in Afghanistan, mainly on ecological issues and the peace process, with the support of a local partner organization, and we do this until today. This is only to give you a short background on the engagement of Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung in Afghanistan, and as a kind of a pretext for today's discussion here in this panel. I would really like to congratulate the organizers of this panel to the selection of this topic. It is, from my point of view, really one of the most pressing and important questions for the international community, how to continue working in Afghanistan under the current very difficult circumstances. To my mind, the international community is really confronted with a dilemma. On one side, we have a situation that since the takeover of the Taliban, we observe massive human rights violations. We have a dramatic increase in poverty levels, which creates a humanitarian crisis for the population. And all these facts actually would call for a massive support of the international community, particularly for the suffering population. But on the other side, we have the de facto government by the Taliban, which has not been legitimized and is responsible for the ban of women from higher education and work in the NGO sector, and for many other human rights violations, which is the reason why this government is not recognized by the international community and why international support for Afghanistan dropped considerably. But the question remains what to do in this situation. Can the international community afford to leave Afghanistan alone, and particularly the people of Afghanistan alone? Are there possibilities to increase the cooperation and the support to the people without formally recognizing the Taliban? All these questions are being discussed at the moment on many levels on local level, on national level, but also in international fora. This panel will address these difficult questions, and I wish you a very good debate and hope that some new ideas will emerge out of this discussion. Now I would like to hand over to the organizers of this panel and like to thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, hello from our side as well, and thank you, Mr. Palachai, and thank you, Mrs. Neubert, for the warm welcoming words. And yeah, also welcome from our side to the last panel discussion of our discussion series with the title International Cooperation in Afghanistan, a way forward with or without the Taliban. Anastasia is my co-host. Can you quickly say hi?
Hello, everyone.
And me, Janis, we will guide you through today's discussion, and afterwards we are going to have a questions and answers session where Sophia will guide us through.
Hi, everybody.
But first of all, I would highlight some technical details, and let me quickly share my screen for that. First of all, there will be a simultaneously interpretation of the discussion and the Q&A session from English to German. So please follow the instructions in the chat to choose the language of your choice. We also have questions for the audience later in the event, which will show up on your screen and can be answered within a Zoom link at the given time. So I hope now you can all see the technical detail file. And I'm going to continue with highlighting quickly the agenda of today's panel discussion. First, we're going to start with a little introduction video, and afterwards we present the panelists. We give a little introduction to them. Then we are going to have a quick Zoom poll, and afterwards we are starting with the discussion round, which will be around 60 minutes. After that, we're having a second Zoom poll and continue with a question and answers session, which will be around 20 minutes. The Q&A session will be after the discussion, so please write all your questions in the chat, which you can reach at the bottom of your screen, and we hope to discuss all of them later on. Please also highlight with the thumbs up option if you like a question and want to hear an answer regarding that question. This will make it easier to pick the questions that are of high interest within our audience. Please also state the name within your question so we can directly forward the question to one of our panelists. If you have any technical content-related question, please also ask them in the Q&A chat, where our technical team tries its best to answer all your questions. Our main aim of this discussion round is to gather new information about the updates in Afghanistan from experts in the field from different perspectives. Therefore, we're looking forward to a lively discussion between our panelists and have prepared some guideline questions. Furthermore, we would like to answer as many questions from our audience as possible within the given time constraint. But first, I'll hand over to Anastasia, who will show you a short introduction video.
Thank you, Janis.
As Yanis just mentioned, our colleagues prepared a short video input for you to get some updates about the current situation in Afghanistan. And our colleague Sophia conducted an interview with Ms. Habiba Sarabi, the former governor of Bamiyan province, the first Afghan woman to become a provincial governor, and she also has served as Afghanistan's Minister of Culture and Education. You will see this interview in our video input as well. And now I will just ask our technic team to turn it on. Thank you.
Afghanistan is a country with a rich history and diverse population. Despite decades of political instability and conflict, the Afghan people have shown remarkable strength and resilience. Afghan society is characterized by cultural and ethnic diversity, which is expressed in languages, customs, and ways of life. However, there are also major challenges in the country, such as the Islamic fundamentalist group called the Taliban. Founded in 1994, they took control over the Afghan state in 1996 after a 4-year period of civil war. After the deposition by the US-led invasion in 2001, the Taliban operated 20 years in the shadows of insurgency and regained power after the final withdrawal of ISAF forces in 2021. As a result of their strict interpretation and resurrection of Islamic law, the socio-economic situations of women and other discriminated gender exacerbated vastly, although previous statements promised to respect the rights of women and minorities within the norms of Islamic law.
From the day that they took power, they banned a woman to work and later on for education. And now more than 100 decree or edict they issue, and 98% of them, they are against women. Mostly they are focusing on women, women education, women work, women to be in the public. Even women are not allowed to go to bath, public bath. You know that even they are against the cleanness. They don't want women to be clean and stylish. So they ban women to they can go to the park, and so everything. I mean, finally we can say that everything is banned for women. Women is like they are living in a prison, so they cannot go anywhere and cannot work. I think Afghanistan is the only country that women legally are not allowed to go to school. So this is really terrible. And beside that, unfortunately, the minority and also the former military people, they are also under pressure and getting arrested by Taliban and receiving a lot of punishment.
Meanwhile, Afghanistan is on the edge of economic and humanitarian crisis. The Taliban struggle to stabilize the country, along with recent droughts and massive economic recession, mainly caused by the withdrawal of Western aid. Today, nearly 50% of Afghan households are food insecure, whereas female-headed households are over-proportionally affected. Germany, which suspended its bilateral development cooperation in 2021, has not yet developed a coherent Afghanistan strategy. One reason for this is the violation of women's rights that is incompatible with the German government's feminist foreign policy. In face of the humanitarian crisis, however, the German government responded with over 1 billion euros worth in humanitarian assistance. It has been agreed on by the European Council that humanitarian assistance will be given mainly via multilateral bodies.
I mean, the women that from the other minority group, for example, I am from the Hazara minority group, but I have close contact with the people or women that they are inside the country. And so the situation that they are talking about, that it's really terrible. yesterday I had the meeting with 12 of these women, because they have a network, they have a movement and a network. And with some of them, we are regularly through our forum. And also personally, I have contact with them to get situation. Even for the humanitarian aid, they were, one of them, she emphasized that the humanitarian aid is not distributing fairly, and a lot of, at the beginning, the Taliban military will take their own part, and after that, not the rest of them will they distribute to the people. And even the distribution is not fair according to the place. For example, some place, some provinces, they are getting, receiving the humanitarian aid, but some provinces, for example, in the north or central part, they are not getting enough for the fair distribution. These are the situation, unfortunately, inside Afghanistan.
Today, Germany is facing a normative dilemma. It must forge links between its feminist policy cornerstones and a worsening humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. Besides, it seems unlikely that the Taliban will redirect their course of action. In contrast, their uncompromising actions have revealed will and commitment to perpetuate their power ambitions. Meanwhile, the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation are filling in power gaps. Driven by their own security concerns, both regional players will point their commitment towards preventing fundamentalist groups to seep in their influence spheres. Obviously, commitments towards human rights, especially women's rights issues, are highly unlikely to be expected.
Whenever we are getting contact with the people inside Afghanistan, they are really very tired. They are saying that we are always getting some news, the verbal thing. Not the real action. And many people said, okay, this is something that the people and the international community are cheating you, and they have to take some action. I know that the situation is very bad, and now it's a kind of deadlock. I can see that for the international community. International community started to do in Afghanistan they were talking about democracy, women's rights, human rights, and all of these. What happened to all of these phenomenon? And this is the same, that the rights of human beings are demolishing in Afghanistan and vanishing. Actually, the women and minority were vanished from the public in Afghanistan. For example, you can see the Hindu or Sikh that they were in Afghanistan, but a big number of them left, and only maybe some family were left there. So this is the same place, the same country, the same people, the same culture. Why international community cannot take practical action for that? And in different way, they can communicate with each other. First of all, my message to the German government is about this accepting more people, registering for in Germany. This is something that there should be a monitoring system on that, and that the real activists and the journalists and the people they are eligible for that can get the access to visa. And the second one is toward women. Women of Afghanistan are really in a great need. Of course, the online education is not a solution, but this is not a permanent solution. But temporarily, it is good that we can support, and the international community in Germany can support this online education program. Through its own channel, should push the UNAMA to fulfill their mandate. because the mandate of UNAMO is very good, but the problem is the implementation, fulfilling the mandate is another issue, especially on the humanitarian, on the human rights issue. I think, and many other people, Afghan people and diaspora think that UNAMO is focusing mostly on humanitarian aid because it's much easier for them. So the human rights, which is a big issue in Afghanistan, they are not focusing a lot. This is something that I want from the German government and German politician to push them for that.
Until now, the German political apparatus is in a state of perplexity, not only in regard to the Afghanistan issue, but also in terms of the mere nature of future German interventions. Therefore, a clear and future-oriented Afghanistan strategy is much needed. But what does this really mean for the future of cooperation with Afghanistan? Can Germany continue to support the Afghan population without cooperating with the new regime?
I hope you could get an overview about the current situation in Afghanistan, and as well as the situation regarding women and girls at the moment. And before we will start our discussion, we would like to introduce our podium's guest to our audience. And we are very happy to have Ms. Hosna Jalil with us. She is native of Afghanistan, is currently displaced since 2021, and is joining us from the United States. Ms. Jalil, could you quickly say hi to our audience?
Hi, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Ms. Jalil is a former deputy minister in the Ministry of Women's Affairs in Afghanistan. She also served as a deputy minister for policy and planning in her government's Ministry of Women's Affairs. And before, she also used to serve as the deputy interior minister for policy and strategy, as well as a year before she coordinated the government's efforts to combat illegal mining at the Ministry of Mines and Petroleum. Thanks again for taking time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me.
We are also happy to welcome Deborah Düring on our virtual stage today. If you quickly want to turn on your video and say hi as well.
Hello.
She is the representative of the German parliament from the German Green Party, Bündnis 90 Die Grünen, as Speaker for Development Policies, member of the Economic Cooperation and Development Committee, the Financial Committee, and the Subcommittee for Global Health. Ms. Düring is also a deputy member of the Enquete Commission Afghanistan, Lehren aus Afghanistan für das zukünftige vernetzte Engagement, or Lessons from Afghanistan for Germany's future synergical engagement.
And another guest at our panel discussion today is Dr. Arne Strand. Mr. Strand, could you also say hi to our guests today?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking me in here.
Thank you for taking time to participate. Mr. Strand is a senior researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute. He directed Norwegian NGO work in Afghanistan between 1988 and 1997, and he holds a PhD in post-war recovery studies from the University of York, UK. Mr. Strand also led a number of evaluations and political economy analysis relating to Afghanistan, and is currently involved in a research project on China's developmental peace approach in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Thanks for being here once again.
Before we will start with the discussion, we want to encourage our audience again to ask your questions in the chat. And in the last 20 minutes, we will have the opportunity to forward as many of your questions as possible to our panelists. But first of all, we would like to hear from the audience about their perception of German development cooperation in Afghanistan. And therefore, we have prepared a short question which should show up on your screen now. So please select one of the prepared yes or no answers by clicking the corresponding button on your screen. Regarding the question, should Germany cooperate with the Taliban in Afghanistan? So I will wait for another couple of seconds. Then I hope that I can see the results. So yeah, we can see that around 32% said yes, Germany should further cooperate, and 68% said no. So we will keep that in our minds during the discussion and see what our panelists will say.
Thank you for the participation in our quick Zoom poll. And now we are finally starting with the round of our entry questions. And our first question would go to Ms. Jalil. Ms. Jalil, could you give us a little update about the current living conditions in Afghanistan, especially for women and girls, and maybe also to share how are you right now in exile?
Again, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be to take part in this discussion along with the great panelists, and thank you so much for organizing the event. When it comes to the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, I think it's getting worse and not better. I mean, just looking at what's happening in Afghanistan for the past almost 2 years. The crisis, I mean, we did have a level of poverty rate in Afghanistan even before the collapse. Let's accept that. But with the political change, it has gotten worse, partially because the Taliban are not able to function as a government or provide government services, and partially because the international community does not offer the support that they used to offer the support. I mean, based on the limitations they have. And then on the other hand, one is the government capability, which I think is less problematic. But on the other hand, it's the Taliban regime's policies, which is making it worse. And that has led, of course, to the level of migration that we have and exposing migrants to smuggling. And then we have the education, the freedom crisis in Afghanistan. No one is free to think, to express themselves, or to exercise their very basic right as human being. And then, of course, the economic crisis, the collapse of the banking system in Afghanistan, and then the collapse of the economy in general, which was relying on aid. I mean, a huge part of it was relying on aid, which is no longer the same as it used to be. So it's all not just the Taliban's capability to handle the change, but also because of their policies. So I would say mention the roots of the crisis. I would say the Taliban's policies, and education being one of them. The women's ban women's ban from universities, from high schools, from secondary schools, but then at the same time, the Taliban themselves are adding to the humanitarian crisis, not just through their policies, but through their actions. The level of torture, the level of suppression of the civil movements, the level of suppression of the media, it's not just in their policies, it's also in their actions. So I would say, yes, we tend to hear less from Afghanistan compared to 2021, because it has become an old topic on the media, but the situation is getting worse. And the Taliban has got more peace of mind actually to exercise their oppressive, I would say, policies on the people of Afghanistan. And yes, when it comes to the German government's cooperation, I mean, it's tricky to say to cooperate with the Taliban. I would say, yes, the German government needs to help the Afghan people. But does that mean that they have to cooperate with the Taliban? Partially, yes, partially, no. We can discuss that in details later with the panel discussions. And how I'm doing in exile. Migration is never easy. We are trying our best to make it easy. The people around us actually are trying to make it easy for us. The host nations are trying to make it easy for us. And definitely those of us who are in the West have got an easier transition, I would say, compared to the people who are in Pakistan, in Turkey, Iran, and any other country. I mean, the regional countries, partially because of the number of migrants in those countries, partially because of their policies. But end of the day, migration is never easy, leaving your home with less than a backpack. So yeah, it has been challenging, but I'm glad that I'm surrounded with great people.
Happy to hear that, and we appreciate sharing this personal moments. And the next question goes to Ms. Düring. As we just heard from Ms. Jalil, the situation is getting worse and the Taliban policies are making the situation worse. So our question is, what are the current efforts of the Enquete Commission to tackle this? And we would be also very thankful if you would shortly explain what it is to our audience and what are the main focus of the Enquete Commission on Afghanistan.
Ja, vielen Dank auch von meiner Seite für die Einladung und für die Organisation des Panels. Jetzt höre ich mich gerade doppelt.
Thank you very much for the invitation and also for the organization of the panel. I think it's very important that we continue to focus on Afghanistan time and again. And in the German Bundestag, after the fall of Kabul, also in the parliament, we asked ourselves many times, so what actually went wrong and who's responsible for it, and what kind of responsibility does the German government and the German parliament has to bear? So what was our share in this catastrophe? And I mean, it culminated basically in the last month and the catastrophic situation, also with regard to the withdrawal. However, it already started beforehand. And so the German Bundestag said we would like to look more into it in order to find out what went wrong and what are the conclusions also for the future, our future commitment, the commitment of the German government. So we have an investigation committee which looked into the last weeks and the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And in parallel, we have set up a so-called Enquete Commission. And at the beginning, the Enquete Commission will first of all look at the past 20 plus years, what has happened in Afghanistan, what role did the German Development Cooperation play, and also the question of when did we talk to the Taliban? Did we talk to the Taliban, or should we have intervened at one or the other in one of the other situations? And right now, as I said, we are trying to get an overview, first of all, which is a real challenge, admittedly. So we conduct many talks, discussions with civil society actors here in Germany, but also the Afghan civil society, which is still on the ground, or with the diaspora, the Afghan diaspora. And second, later on, we will draw some conclusions from it. I am part of the project group 2, and I'm looking into development cooperation and what went wrong in the development cooperation, and also with regard to humanitarian aid and the nexus approach. But another question is, did we actually manage to help, or did we create dependency? Should we have more invested into the economic buildup of the country? So I cannot give you an answer at the moment, but these are basically the questions that we looking into the Enquête Commission on Afghanistan. And to come back to what the previous speakers already said, of course, we continue to, as the German Bundestag and also as a development policy spokesperson, we are focusing on our future commitment. How can we continue our engagement with regard to humanitarian aid, but also with regard to the so-called development cooperation in the future? And at the beginning, it has already been mentioned, how do we manage to provide protection to those people who are here through the procedure for our locally employed staff and others, even though it's not hitting the headlines on a daily basis, but we are discussing it constantly in the German Bundestag in order to improve the situation for the people in Afghanistan, but also the situation of those people who manage to get out or who want to get out or who already are in Germany.
So we also want to give Mr. Strand the opportunity for an opening statement. So first of all, how are you? You just landed in Bergen. We hope you arrived and settled well. We have heard brief updates about the situation in Afghanistan and what the German government is doing at the moment and how they try to recap the last 20 years. Can you update us on the European approach towards the Taliban, and are there any differences between, for example, Norway's and Germany's approach?
No, a good question, but I'd like to pick up a bit on some of the reflections that's already been here, because I think it's important to keep in mind that the situation was far from positive before 2021 as well, and which was part of the reason actually why Taliban could take over control. Nobody really knows how many trillions of dollars that went into Afghanistan compared with US, European support for it. But by 2021, Afghanistan was still the poorest country in South Asia. Poverty was over 60%. That had increased from 2014. 80% of the women, at least here in Norway, been highlighted on importance of education, were still illiterate, and that was after 20 years of massive support of assistance. So I welcome, I've been part of some EU discussion on this as well, what failed. And part of it was a lack of attention to mismanagement and massive corruption. And that also why a lot of people lost trust in the Afghan government at that time. And although they did not necessarily want the Taliban, they didn't take an active stand to support that government that then left. So and also a government then being completely dependent, or rather 75% dependent of international support. So that placed it in a difficult position. So in a sense, we also are part of the reason for why things went wrong. But then if we go on a bit, because the EU was early out and put five very strict conditions to the new Taliban government, including on the rights of women, allowing humanitarian assistance, not keeping terrorists or allowing terrorist organization to function on Afghan soil. And as this was not somehow responded to by the Taliban, and a very effective, I would call a sanction came in place, including of Afghan central bank reserves. But an important decision was made to not continue with development assistance. And for Norway, it would mean that our oil income had been cut off tomorrow, to make a comparison. But then what was also decided at the same time was to continue as a policy humanitarian assistance. I think that's the same for Norway as with Germany. And with the focus, but they called it humanitarian plus, that meant continuing our assistance for health services and a lot of support that was then meant to not hurt those most vulnerable in the Afghan population. But conditions, no assistance through the Taliban government, but rather through the UN organizations, and then to be implemented by NGOs throughout Afghanistan. But it's also been already stated there is an extremely challenging situation at the moment. But there are also some curiosities, because the Afghan economy, in a sense, when it comes to tax income, is better today than it was under the Republic. Taliban has been better at collecting taxes, and there was less corruption in the system. They still continue to pay salaries for governmental staff including for female teachers that are not working. So in a sense, that has stabilized. There are international companies, especially from China, who are willing to invest in Afghanistan again. And then it's this somehow we need to keep in mind that the level of security, despite denial of all rights, have allowed girls up to 6th grade to continue in school, actually more now than before 2021. So it's a complex picture, and it's important to keep this in mind. Also, the efforts now being done to eradicate poppy. So we need to look at a lot of different factors, not stating that the Taliban is not a challenge. Certainly they are, but there are also other things happening that we need to keep an eye on. But the situation for the common Afghans, much worse today than it was in 2021. Thank you.
So after the opening statements of our panelists, we will continue with our first topic, German Development Corporation's lessons learned, expectations and demands. And I would like to start with Ms. Jalil with the question, how do you perceive Germany's support for Afghanistan after 2021? And what do you think that Germany should do in Afghanistan at the moment?
Thank you. Germany has been one of the international partners in Afghanistan who have been massively engaged in Afghanistan's reconstruction before the collapse of the Afghan government, particularly in the north. And among the common public, of course, or the general public, it has a very positive image when it comes to its development activities and the efficiency of the resource management, of course. Post-2021, of course, again, Germany has been one of the countries that has accepted a mass number of Afghan migrants, or has hosted a mass number of Afghan migrants in Germany. And I would say Afghans are happy, actually. Those who have settled in Germany or those who have migrated to Germany. I mean, the German government has helped them to, or has made the process easy for them actually to resettle there. But when it comes to German government's engagement in Afghanistan with the Afghan people who are inside Afghanistan or inside Afghan border, living under the rule of the Taliban. What I would propose, I mean, at the political level, we need more voices in terms of the international community's red lines, or the international community's red lines on what they can compromise. I mean, no matter what, the Taliban have been ambitious about their recognition, and they will still remain, I mean, they've still remained ambitious and very hopeful. So they keep lobbying for getting the recognition. I would say, yes, German government can engage with the Taliban. No one is against the engagement, but that engagement should not translate into an easygoing recognition, or at least even if that recognition is conditional, we need to keep in mind the conditions of the Doha peace deal. So the German government, I think, can take a political stance when it comes to the Taliban's recognition, and using that as a leverage against the Taliban in order to moderate their policies or improve their actions, of course, on the ground, and just giving them the red light that they're not going to get the recognition, of course, unless they improve the situation. And Germany can be a strong voice as well around the table. Of course, Germany is not the only country, but can be the greatest voice. Germany has been doing great, but we need further support on that. When it comes to the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, responding to the humanitarian crisis, yes, Germany has been involved in that, and we would love to see the support to be continued. It is a terrible crisis on the ground, but what I would say is that there are ways to deal with the crisis in Afghanistan with the minimum engagement with the Taliban. So what I would expect from Germany, or I mean, there are many Afghans who would expect, or who are hopeful actually, to see that there's the minimum engagement, possible engagement with the Taliban, because we don't want the Taliban to be empowered with the money of the international community, or the money which is supposed to go to the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. Yeah, so and the third aspect of it, or the third I would say rule that the engagement that the German government can play, or Germany can play, is the facilitation of an engagement between the Afghans as well, because they both are two parties in conflict. It's so difficult for them to talk to each other without a facilitator. So Germany can play the role of that facilitator. I mean, I would love to see that Afghans are talking to each other among themselves without a facilitation, but just because there are two hardcore conflicting parties, it's so difficult to have to go ahead without any facilitator that is considered unbiased. So that is an important role that the German government and Germany can play in the whole situation, because without having a political solution to the current crisis, it's going to be a never-ending crisis in Afghanistan, the humanitarian one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good question to forward to Mrs. Düring, and I would also encourage you. You can always step in and directly answer to questions if you want to. But Mrs. Düring, we have just heard about the wishes from Ms. Jalil, and this maybe goes out for a lot of Afghan people, that there should be maybe more presence of Germany in Afghanistan at the moment. So what do you think that Germany should do or could do at the moment in Afghanistan?
Well, I would like to come back to a previous comment from Ms. Jalil, because she emphasized that the people who fled from Afghanistan and who are here in Germany are taken care of well in Germany. But of course, as a German parliamentarian, I would have a more critical stance. Of course, it's right. And it's also our responsibility to take in people. But nevertheless, we have to say that there's many people left in Afghanistan, also locally employed staff and their families, their relatives, who are still waiting for the possibility to leave. And on the other hand, we have to say that the care, for example, also psychosocial care still needs to be improved. I mean, it's not very good in Germany in general, but when it comes to the Afghan refugees who came to this country, it's even worse. So theoretically, they all have access to the German labor market, but I tend to hear reports time and again where it does not work out well. And so we as Germany and German parliament, but also as the German civil society and German NGOs, for example, we still have a long way to go, because just getting people out is one thing, but we have to offer them all the possibilities in this country as well to arrive well, so to speak. This is one aspect. And now I would like to talk about your question, what else can Germany do? I think that Germany, or the Foreign Office at the moment, holds the position that we do not directly cooperate or talk to the Taliban, that we do not recognize the Taliban as a government. Below that, Germany is already doing quite a bit. It has already been mentioned there's a lot of humanitarian aid, but there's also development cooperation on the ground already. However, it has been implemented after the work ban of women. We say only with women, for women. So only where women are allowed to work, we provide this money, this funding and the projects. But at the same time, we have to say, I mean, there are projects and there are also discussions at the local level. So we are, or NGOs are constantly negotiating at the local level with the respective responsible people on the ground and ask under which condition they can continue with their work or not. And I think it is our task from a German perspective to make sure that, for example, funds are available in flexible ways. So when an NGO tomorrow, for example, would say, okay, we now get the permission to work with women in this or that project, that we then provide funding. And if it's no longer possible, but there's another project, then we fund the other project. And at the same time, I think that the issue of the humanitarian aid needs to be addressed. We need to be very active here. And we also need the flexibility of funding. And we have to make sure that those people who cannot yet implement a project at that moment are still being paid, that they still get their salary and that we fund them. Second question, whether Germany can be a mediator or take on a mediating role. I think under the current situation, it is not possible. We don't know what the future will bring. We will have to wait and see. I do think that in the course of what Germany is doing at the moment, which is supporting local and small projects, but at the same time to support multilateral support, humanitarian aid with the multilateral organizations, so to continue to provide continuous financial support, which is also questions, sometimes from Germany, but also from other sides. So, and to guarantee this flexibility of funding, but at the same time to make sure that the people who are here in Germany get access to all necessary means that they need at the moment, and to continue to make sure that this program to get locally employed staff out of Afghanistan and to Germany is fully implemented, and that we continue to do so. If people want to leave. Thank you.
Mr. Strand, do you have anything to add to the question?
Strand, haben Sie noch etwas hinzuzufügen?
How do you perceive Germany's support
als Antwort auf diese
Afghanistan after
Frage. Wie nehmen Sie
2021?
das wahr? Unterstützung Deutschlands seit 2021. Ja, ich werde ein paar, sorry.
Ears, I need to turn that off. But point is that there are also Afghan initiatives for dialogue. Some old friends of mine, including people who worked on call it the Afghan peace scene for 30 years, are taking initiatives for Afghans to talk together. But they're also saying that we need to address the root causes of the problems in Afghanistan, not only the political challenge today, but there are underlying problems that need to be addressed for Afghans to jointly come forward. And I think that that's extremely important, because it's not only one question and one, we call it mediation, that needs to take on. There is a dialogue of reconciliation that needs to come on, because somehow this war has not lasted for 20 years. It lasted for 40 years. And we need to keep that in mind, because that makes something with people's mind and trust in each other. This with the German policy, but let me dwell a bit about two options, because whatever is said, the health sector and education in the health sector for women is still continuing. Strangely enough, but that was also the case during the first round of Taliban. Increasing support for that, I think, is valuable, because that has been denied. The dilemma is then that you need people educated, girls educated from 6th to university grade, to continue to have women that can continue the health education. But the health sector as such is an area that it can be invested in. Secondly, the private sector, because there is no ban on women working in the private sector, it's rather encouraged. And thinking private partnerships, this could also be an opportunity to develop and probably even do more for women private entrepreneurs that was done during the 20 last years. So there are some opportunities here that I think it's important that we somehow make use of, despite the limitations that are into it. Germany has a good reputation in Afghanistan. I agree. All the work being done in northern Afghanistan, a lot of German NGOs that has been diligent and doing good work. But then comes the question, is it mediation that is needed at the moment, or is it dialogue? Is it, I'm thinking about something that I would define as multiple dialogues, because it's not only one question. There are a number of questions that could be discussed. One is upholding the principles of access for humanitarian assistance, certainly the issues of girls' education and women's right to work. Question at times is also, who are best positioned to do that? I've been talking to an organization of Islamic organization that is engaging on actually women's right to work and education according to Islamic law. They might have more influence on the Taliban than we have in some of these questions. China, Russia, neighboring countries are also emphasizing girls' education. They might also have larger pressure on it. So I think let's not just think about one mediation done on changes, but let's talk of multiple dialogues. Dilemma then is that I need to be in Kabul. And at the moment, the EU and including Norway have no permanent representation here. So there are, and in that sense, the NGOs and the UN agencies becomes the diplomats on our behalf. They're in a difficult position then, but I think also to add, because although they are not talking too loudly about it, they are welcome and they are invited into large parts of Afghanistan, and women are still working with NGOs, they are still doing education work, they are still invited to do a lot of the things done before. And so these things are continuing, but it's kept on a low profile because to protect those involved in it, and but somehow keeps a dilemma. But a lot of the activities are continued, even if it's not broadcasted. So Germany absolutely continue, and it's to find this balance by not recognizing, but maintaining what I define as a constructive dialogue on issues where you seek to find possibly a common ground, or at least where you clearly get your message through that this is what needs to be done. And just a final thing, because on the issues of girls' education and employment, it's very obvious that the Taliban at the moment is very divided. There are people strongly advocating for it in the middle of their government. They might need support to have those arguments listened to in Kandahar as well. Thank you.
These are very interesting insights, that there's still some potential, for example, like you just said, in the health sector to invest in it. And this would be a good transition to our next discussion block, namely that's the cooperation with the Taliban itself. And Mr. Strand, we would like to continue with you once again. We know that the cooperation with the groups labeled as terrorists is a taboo on international arena. What would be the alternatives? Because if without this cooperation, there's no possibility to help people on the ground.
This is a dilemma, but there are openings, because it's not the entire Taliban that are defined as terrorists, and both by the UN and the US administration and their terrorists. It's individuals, and some of the sanction that was put in place early on has, especially by the United States, been lifted to actually enable assistance, to enable economic development, and to enable more of ensuring that the sanctions policies against some in the Taliban is not hitting the population. So they have actually gone very far in trying to ensure that even if some are on the terrorist list, the Afghan population is not to suffer. But there is another dilemma here that I think we also need to bring up, and that is that what are the alternatives to the Taliban? We call them the de facto administration. They control much more of Afghanistan today than they did during the 90s when I was working there. Then they only controlled parts of the country. And the dilemma is, and this is where the Afghans also need to have a say. We shouldn't say who should be brought in, but many of the Afghans don't want parts of the former government to come in as well. They don't see them as an alternative, at least all those I've interviewed over the last 2 years. So they are looking for something new. And what that new is then up to the Afghans to decide, according to me. But I see a lot of influential Afghans, both in exile, but also inside Afghanistan, that have the trust in the population and could hopefully be an alternative. But then Taliban need to decide that they want to share their power. They won't share it with former ministers, with people that they somehow directly associate with the former government. But this is probably the issue, that there is much pressure on them at the moment. But there is also a question to what extent they're then hitting down on the international terrorist groups, because that's another concern. What we have seen is that they haven't been too strict on Al-Qaeda, and I would say those who fought in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, because they see them as someone who supported them, or those that fought with them against our invasion, as they term it. But the Islamic State, they have consequently gone after. And just yesterday and today, there have been attacks by the Islamic State on Taliban. The worry, and that goes for our participants as well in the introduction, they have also gone after the Hazara minority, the Shia minority. So they are the one at the moment that poses a larger threat against the Afghan population. So in one sense, while Taliban can be regarded as a terrorist group, they are at least doing some, according to the Doha Agreement, to fight some elements of other terrorist groups in Afghanistan as well. But it's challenging, because you need to engage with them, you need to talk to them, as I said earlier, just to be able also to convey the message. And to quote an old friend of mine that was long associated with the former Taliban government, they need to understand how the international community looks like, because many of these have been in the field fighting for many years. They need to be introduced how we think, because otherwise they won't understand our positions as well. And this is, again, dialogue.
Ms. Jalil, I would forward this question, or what Mr. Strand just said, that in the West we always talk about the Taliban. So Mr. Strand just mentioned that the Taliban is highly divided and might make even the situation of women better in some regions, or at least in some sectors in Afghanistan. Would you agree on that?
Two things, actually. In response to the comments Mr. Strand made. The first one, when it comes to women's employment, I don't agree with the statement partially. When it comes to the women's employment, yes, there has been NGOs who have been negotiating with the Taliban individually, and the Taliban have given them partial permission. For example, for the Norwegian committee, it's only in Kandahar. Or Save the Children, or any other, I would say, NGOs on the ground. It has been partial, but at the same time, it has been very conditional. And the other aspect of it is that, yes, I do hear that women are, for example, active with the small artisans at the Turkish mountain, for example. That's one of the examples. But the permission is, it's partial. We can hardly generalize that, because that's less than a few percentage of the women work, the female workforce. The second aspect of it is that the permission in many cases are verbal. That's the biggest problem. This uncertainty behind it, when the Taliban is going to revoke that permission, or when the Taliban is even going to revoke the letter that they have given individually to the NGOs, dealing with a regime that is not holding itself accountable, and no one can hold them accountable. I think that is the major problem, one part of it. The other aspect of it, women who have been self-employed, no, they're not able to continue with what they've been doing in the past. Not at all. Even when you see a small, for example, in Afghanistan, a small female-led small bazaar, even the customers are limited now. They are unable to, let alone the I would say, the facilities, including the banking systems or anything else that can facilitate their, I would say, entrepreneurial ventures or businesses, small businesses. Even the policies that the Taliban have right now, even if they would open their shop, they don't have customers, because the Taliban are regulating their customers, who should go there, who should not go there. That's the biggest, the major problem. Okay, let me put it into perspective here. Only a woman can shop from a female shopkeeper in Mazar, for example. And then at the same time, the woman is not, I mean, the man is not allowed to enter that shop. But then on the other side, a woman is not allowed to get out of her house without a man. So how is that possible that that woman can go to that shopkeeper? I mean, it's just the underlying nuances that makes it impossible actually for a woman to sell anything. But I mean, even the women shopkeepers that we are talking about, they don't make like 10% of what we used to have. That's the biggest problem first. And then when it comes to the women in the government, the employment, yes, only teachers are getting paid, but what about the rest of them? We have had 28% of the 500,000 civil servants among women, like around 28 to 30% of them have been women. So what happens to the rest of them first? The second thing is that it's not sustainable. And again, Taliban doesn't have accountability. They can stop the payment as soon as they deal with financial hardship. So who's going to hold them accountable? So I mean, there are so many aspects that it's so difficult for me to believe that this is going forward, but at the same time, the woman would have, I mean, can have the peace of mind actually that they are able to bring food on the table tomorrow for their kids. And we are dealing, most of these civil servants that we are talking about, most of them have been breadwinners for their families or single moms. In the police force where I used to work at the Ministry of Interior with, we've had 62% breadwinners and single moms. And that is a proportion of, that's a representation of women workforce in other sectors as well. And then the second aspect that I wanted to respond to is when it comes to the Taliban stance on countering terrorism. Yes, they're getting, that was part of the Doha deal, and they're getting financial assistance for that. But from my perspective, no, the Taliban is not fighting terrorism. If they're dividing terrorism between good terrorism and bad terrorism, they're fighting ISIS because ISIS is their enemy, not the international, not a threat to the global security. And then they're cooperating with Al-Qaeda, they're training for Al-Qaeda. I would say that they are fighting their own enemy within the terrorist organizations or the terrorism spectrum, and somehow facilitating or paving the way for the dominance of one or two terrorist groups which are allies to them. So from my perspective, no, they're not fighting terrorism as a global security challenge. They're fighting terrorism based on their own internal, I would say, ambitions. But yes, when it comes to the, when it comes to the dialogues and, the initiation of those dialogues, and we do need multiple dialogues at the same time. Yes, I do agree in that. Afghans on the other side are very much divided when it comes to even among diaspora, when it comes to even defining an inclusive government, like what an inclusive government means. So yes, we on this side, we are a little bit, not a little bit, but we are divided. The Afghan population, that I call them survivors, whoever does good to them, they're going to be on their side. And I do agree with Strand, Mr. Strand, that the Afghan population, before the collapse of the Afghan government, they had remained undecided. They had grievances with the previous government, but that doesn't mean that by default they chose the Taliban. So they are, after 40 years of war, they've turned into a survivor part of the community, and that makes majority of the Afghan population. and then you have two other factions in Afghanistan, or population. One is the Taliban, which are the extremists. The other one is the group that is fighting back the Taliban. We on our side are divided. The Taliban are on their side are divided, which also an opportunity or a bright spot for a dialogue. As far as there's diverse, I would say, ways of thinking, but at the same time, it's a challenge. But there's one thing that the Taliban on the other side, yes, they are divided, but it's very difficult. I mean, that's also an opportunity to work with them or to engage with them, or at least to start talking to them. But in the other aspect of it, yes, they might be politically motivated. They might not mean actually to uphold the women's rights values or women's education. They may not believe in that. The division might be based on political ambitions or economic interests, clearly. I mean, that's how I would label that. But end of the day, no matter what that is leading or that crack is helping us to build on that, or to start dialogue, or to start engagement with them or talk to them. But then another aspect of it is that the supreme leader holds the ultimate power. That's the problem. Yes, the branches that we are talking about, including Haqqani, including Minister of Defense Mullah Yaqub, yes, they are, I would say they can be used as a lead to build on that cracks, or to talk to them, or to talk to them about the moderation of their policies. But at the end of the day, the supreme leader is, at this point in time, I mean, I can't see any way that anyone can talk to them, at least not in the coming future. But he's also a ghost. That's the problem. The regime that we are talking right now doesn't have a face. The biggest challenge, I think, that the Afghan population in Afghanistan and out of Afghanistan is dealing with is that the regime doesn't have a face. It's led by a ghost. And I can hardly say that mass majority of the Taliban, yes, I mean, because they do hardly believe in their regime or the religious element in there. I mean, they're made to believe that the guy is there. But the problem is that we all doubt that someone with that name even exists. So it's very difficult, actually. I mean, we all are in a very difficult spot, that who we are dealing with, who has the power, and they're still operating like an insurgency. They don't let the population know how they're functioning. They're not like a proper government that you can see, like, okay, who's who. So that's also why it's very difficult for us on our side to, regardless of the divisions that we have on the concepts, on the definitions, on, I would say, what kind of regime do we want? Yes, absolutely a democratic regime, a regime which upholds the human rights and women's rights, regardless of the differences in the details, particularly when it comes to the tribal aspect of it, or the cultural aspect of it, and how we can make sure that democracy can coexist with religion in Afghanistan, being a religious community, a religious country in a conservative society, or not a conservative, traditional society. Regardless of these divisions, I think there are, on our side, there's one thing that we are clear, is that everyone wants these very basic human rights to be upheld in Afghanistan. So it's challenging. I mean, it's tricky.
Sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to say maybe that's a good topic to hand over to Mrs. Düring, because we were also shortly highlighting, or it has been highlighted, that also neighbor states and states like China or Russia are still active, or more active at least, in Kabul than Germany or other European countries. So what are your thoughts on enhanced regional cooperation with and development aid from autocratic neighbor states of Afghanistan?
Also ehrlich gesagt weiß ich nicht,
Well,
ob ich jetzt aus meiner
honestly speaking, I don't know if I can answer the question from my perspective, what the role of the neighboring countries is in the development cooperation. But there were several questions in the chat already that referred to it. Well, if we could cooperate with them, then we could exert more influence, maybe. So answer number one, if you do not argue on this based on the same level and do not have the same basic values, then the cooperation is difficult. So a completely different example to describe it. If I have apples and pears, then of course the same does not go together. And we see it in there as well. If basic rights like women's rights are not being protected and upheld and not accepted, then the idea that one could actually realize it through pressure, through development aid is simply wrong. It doesn't work. Answer number two, development cooperation should not be linked to conditions in some, and humanitarian aid is another area. And honestly, we are seeing negotiations in order to get access to local structures so that women can work, but we reach our limits there. And we negotiate exceptional regulations, which are then again withdrawn. So I think this idea seems nice at first glance, but at a second glance, I think it's not possible. We need a common ground in order to be able to interact with each other. But linked to that is the question, I mean, you asked about China, for example. I think development cooperation in China, I mean, we could have a separate session on that and the geopolitical interests of China. But I do think that we also have to assume responsibility. I mean, if you look at Pakistan, for example, and we have to try to find out how we can support the people who are in Afghanistan, who went there. And of course, it is, in the end, a dilemma which we cannot solve. So it's the dilemma that, on the one hand, you want to support people, but on the other hand, you have a regime which actually neglects human rights and violates human rights. And I think the solution should be to ask what are the structures on the ground with which we can cooperate. And this is what we do in multilateral structures. Also, the multilateral organizations try to find out how they can cooperate well with local structures. And I think this should be the solution. And I just saw a question in the chat about the report of the Enquête Commission. It will probably be published, or an interim report will be published in spring 2024, and then in 2025 we will have an overall report. And maybe last comment, which was also mentioned in the chat, is the question of the locally employed staff and how we assess the overall situation in Afghanistan. I think we have not yet come to a concluding assessment because we are still discussing and talking to many actors on the ground, but we definitely had a wrong assessment of the situation on the ground in Afghanistan before. And in some areas, still today, when it comes to the threat of family members of former locally employed staff, we are not all in agreement on the situation on the ground today. So it is being discussed. We are discussing it time and again in the political realm, also publicly sometimes. And in the investigation committee, there were locally employed staff who came there to testify. And we also talk about it a lot in the Enquête Commission. And it's also mentioned in the coalition agreement of this government that we want to revise this process, how we get out locally employed staff. The question is, what's our responsibility as the German government when locally employed staff works for us? And I think that we have to be quite clear that we have to assume responsibility for international staff, but also for national staff and also for sub-employees, so to speak, from sub-companies. And we have to come up to our responsibility, not only in Afghanistan, but also in Mali, for example, in Sudan, and all the other conflicts that might come up in the future. And this is something that we intensively discuss in the political realm.
Thank you for the input. And we are now coming to our next topic, and we will now discuss the situation more in detail of women and girls on the ground. And in this thematic block, the first question goes to Dr. Strand. What happens to a society when women are excluded of large parts of life? Are there any evidence, examples about the effects on societies and economies where gender equality has been this abruptly reset?
No, I think what is unique with the current situation is the restrictions being posed on female employment, but also on girls' education. And that is unique, and it's at the moment there are no other countries where these are somehow the same rules. But at the same time, it's also important, I think, to keep in mind that it's very big and variation within Afghanistan for what has been accepted of what you can call girls and women's involvement in different activities. There is, unfortunately, an attitude among men at my age that women's place is in the home, and there have been put a lot of restriction on it. And we see this sometimes also when we look at what has been the practice before the Taliban came in, because in the southern parts of Afghanistan, it was only 5% of the girls that were allowed to go into higher education, even before the Taliban. And that was more, I think, our co-participant here on called it the conservative attitudes within society. And that is still strong. And in that is also where Taliban then leadership might take some of their support for continuing with negative attitudes towards women participation. I think what they totally underestimate is 20 years development, Afghans, including Taliban's, access to social media, and that it's almost impossible today to really uphold that kind of strict policy due to how the world has changed. So when they try somehow to bring back what they leadership perceive as the ideal Afghanistan, that is not what the rest of the population, the majority, see as ideal. Their dilemma then is when they have imposed such a policy, how can they go back and say that, sorry, we were mistaken, now we're going to change? They don't want to be seen as being pushed by the West to make compromises here. So in case, this is where I think some Muslim countries and organizations probably have far larger influence on them and pressure on their religious leaders to engage with them so they can come up and say that, well, according to Sharia, there is no restriction on women for both either education or for work. So this is again, yes, there need to be a change. This is not only about religion, it's also about tradition. And it's also because of all the wars, there has been this protection of the family and protection of the family, both with arms, but also for how that they should be influenced. So it's again, 40 years of conflict that is feeding into a policy that we see today. So, but again, dialogue, but then someone who have a larger influence on the religious side need to talk to them on that. Can I just add, because this is also then, I don't think, just a comment on China. China is not going to come in and take over the development assistance to Afghanistan. Neither are the neighboring countries. But neighboring countries in China are engaging with Taliban at the moment for their own trade purposes. And that might benefit Afghanistan. So it's also this kind of mixed picture of what is going on, and think long-term versus the short-term thing we see now. I think, and I think we are in agreement on that. We don't want war again, because that would be the most devastating thing. And then we are left with very few options, and that is dialogue.
Mr. Jalil, could you share with us what might be the dangers for women if they are participating in any kind of initiatives supporting by the Western countries, considering all the restrictions we just heard?
There was a perception back in later in 2021, and that was that the NGOs or any organization that the women are involved in are at risk. That's why the international community were trying to avoid supporting, assessing the risk in order to decide should they stop the support or should they continue with that support. Here's the thing, most of the organizations back then have been exposed to risks based on their mandate. For instance, even if an organization that was supporting the women's shelter centers or women's protection centers, even if that would have been led and managed by men, the organization would have been at risk. It's so difficult to label that as an, or if like the food delivery is okay. But then if you would have a civil society all led by men, or a civil movement, a civil society that is engaging in civic movements against the Taliban, of course, that is also having similar risks. So it's so difficult to associate the risk only with the gender. But yes, women in Afghanistan, because the Taliban doesn't want them to go out or to raise their voices, they have much higher risk. But the risk is in general, anyone who goes against the Taliban are at risk. And women are even more at risk because they are at the forefront of the anti-Taliban movements, civic movements. So the women who are going out, who are working, most of them, they want their freedom back. And they're loud enough actually to go after their rights or to demand their rights. So those who are working, yes, they are at risk. But when it comes to the women who are working for NGOs or the international organizations or the local organizations that they have negotiated with the Taliban, it's difficult for me to comment if they have risks just because they're working. It's difficult to say that they're working because that's why they're at risk. If the organization has already negotiated or has got the permission for them to work in that organization. But in general, women who are self-employed, women who are working for local organizations, which are criticizing the Taliban or demands their rights or their freedom, yes, they are at risk. So that includes their employees, that includes anyone who is actively participates in their causes.
In the interest of time, Ms. Düring, I already have to apologize in advance to ask you to answer quickly for the next question, which is that in a speech in the Bundestag in November last year, you said that the goals of a feminist development cooperation are to ensure the same rights and the same access to resources for all people worldwide, and that everyone is represented in their diversity. Can you elaborate on how you would like to achieve those goals in Afghanistan, especially in regards to the situation of women and girls?
Ja, und da habe ich jetzt nur kurz Zeit drauf zu antworten.
Well, and now I've only a little time to answer that question. Okay. Well, maybe at the beginning I would like to make a comment, because especially with regard to the feminist development cooperation, I think it's very important to acknowledge that this is not a problem of men and women, but in the end, it's the patriarchal structure that reproduces suppression so that certain people have power and other people do not have power. And I think that this analysis otherwise would be too simple if you would just see it as a problem between men and women. And I think the approach exactly is to break up these structures. And I think it would be arrogant for me to say how we could establish a different structure in Afghanistan. This might also be an issue of feminist development cooperation. The fact that there are so many strong women also as in this call who know much more and much better how to do that. So our task would be rather to support these kind of structures and organizations or strong women who interact with civil society. So to provide support and to build up support structures for that. And second aspect, we should also try to provide resources, financial resources, or maybe also who do we give a voice in a discourse? We should focus more strongly on that. For example, if we look at the Enquete Commission, then due to the current situation, it's a commission which, first of all, consists of many white people. And we said that in every session, we at least want to have one person speaking, coming from Afghanistan, maybe living in the diaspora, but at least be an Afghan voice. So, of course, these are also very diverse voices, but these are aspects where I would say, well, we have to be much more vehemently, and eventually we do not only have to fight the patriarchal structures in Afghanistan, but throughout the whole world in order to come to equity, to an equal treatment of men and women.
Thank you so much for responding so briefly for this complex question. And we are now coming to our last round of questions. So I would ask...
Can I just allow to add one thing here? Because it's something how you look upon Afghanistan. 80% of the population live in rural areas. I was fortunate over many years to be able to travel there. And women work. Women are probably the one who works most in Afghanistan, but not necessarily recognized, not necessarily in kind of jobs that produce the kind of surplus and income. They work in the agriculture sector. They are the one running the agriculture sector. Most of the income in the agriculture sector is actually generated by women. A lot of it from dairy production, all kind of small, but it's local trade. It's not international trade. But I think we need to recognize that they play a major role in the Afghan economy. If that can be strengthened, 80% of the population would actually have major benefits from it. They are often left out. They don't speak English. I've had the pleasure of listening to them because I travel a lot. And I think what's important here is that their voices are also listened to because they are the majority. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Strand. We want to ask you to have a very brief statement in the end, and the question for the final statement is, what do you expect from the German development cooperation in the future? If you could answer in 2 sentences for our audience to have a takeaway, that would be great. And maybe Ms. Jalil, would you like to start?
I mean, what I would expect, and I think I echo the voices of many Afghans, both inside Afghanistan, including my own families, and the voice of the Afghan diaspora that I'm actively engaged with, is that don't look away from Afghanistan. I mean, closing our eyes doesn't mean a problem doesn't exist. And at the end of the day, yes, we do appreciate the 20 years of engagement, but a more stable Afghanistan is going to offer the stability all across the world. So that's all I can say on behalf of many Afghans that I'm engaged with.
Ms. Düring, what demands are from your side to the German development cooperation in relation to Afghanistan?
Well, my demand to the so-called German development cooperation, not only with regard to Afghanistan, but all in all, so everywhere, is to have a critical look inwards. It's development and the possibility to overcome power structures in order to achieve global justice in the end. And at the same time, to actually draw on the expertise, the global expertise, and to try to not to forget the global crises and conflicts, and also to critically reflect on our own role in that.
Thank you, Ms. Düring. Mr. Strand, what are your demands?
Well, I don't think as a Norwegian I shouldn't make any demands on the German government, but I can I can make more an advice, and that is what we see now is that humanitarian assistance, purely humanitarian assistance, is not sufficient to meet the needs. That's well illustrated from this discussion. So it is to open up for smaller development-oriented projects. It's health, it's education, and it's getting the support out into the rural areas as well, where the majority lives. So it's to keep a focus on our options. There are options at the moment, but at the same time, principled dialogue with the Taliban to ensure that some of the dilemmas being lifted out, they need formally to recognize that NGOs can work and women can work in NGOs, not only to give kind of verbal disagreement to that, but that dialogue need to be shaped in a way that it's not seen as we are instructing them to do it, because then they will rather say no. They need to be seen as it's their benefit to do it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much to all of our panelists for this interesting and very contentful discussion. And for the last time, I would also want to highlight again to our audience, please ask your questions in the chat and we will get back to them shortly. Before that, we would like to have a second round of our Zoom question and see whether the discussion had an impact on the perception of German development cooperation in Afghanistan within our audience. So by now you already know how it technically works, so please click on your option of choice regarding the same question: should Germany cooperate with the Taliban in Afghanistan again? Guess we can give it another 10 seconds. We don't have 10 minutes anymore. Thank you. So I've noted before that before the discussion there were 32% saying yes and 68% saying no. So this has clearly changed. Yeah, we're just happy to see that the discussion had an impact. We didn't want to go in any direction, but thank you for your participation.
And now I will briefly sum up what we talked about to remind you that our audience the topics that have been discussed before we jump into the Q&A session. So today we heard about the lessons learned from the German side. We heard about the EU and Norwegian policies with their focus on humanitarian assistance, which is similar in Germany as well, and which is not sufficient according to what we heard from our panelists today. We also have discussed the role of other regional actors, the autocratic regimes, providing development assistance in Taliban and their possible influence. We also heard the call for the more engagement from Germany's side for more attempts to improve the dramatic situation related to the women and girls. And now, as we have refreshed a little bit the content of our discussion, we can move to our next part of today's event. And now I will hand over to our colleague Sophia, who will lead you through the question and answer sessions.
Yeah, once again, hello from my side. I enjoyed the discussion very much, and I'm thankful for the lively participation in the Q&A board. I'm very happy to pass on the audience's questions to the panelists now, starting with the ones with the most likes. We will begin with a question to Mr. Arne Strand. You mentioned that there is some common ground with the Taliban. Can you please elaborate on that?
I was just getting into answering that, but I think what one point is the eradication of drugs, which we just have seen news that almost 80 or maybe more than 90% eradication of poppies have taken place over the last year. This doesn't imply that there won't be heroin coming towards Europe, because that will take several years before there is so much in the stocks. But that is one thing that would benefit both Europe and Afghanistan if the drug production actually is stopped. They did it last time as well when they were in power, but then the Northern Alliance increased their production to the extent that it really didn't make much of a difference. But that is one thing that could be in common. The neutrality of Afghanistan is what they're all frequently discussing with neighboring countries and not interfering. That could be also a kind of point, but that goes then also for that they have to be willing to contain terrorist organizations from not operating internationally. There are some of these points where I think there is a dialogue on some of the issues today that could be strengthened as well. And of course, even if it doesn't seem like there is a joint interest of it, education for girls and women's rights to work is also elements of the Taliban that are arguing for, also out of religious justifications for it. So there are some ground at least for seeking engagement.
All right, Ms. Jalil, thank you so much for your input and for being here today. It might be a difficult question, but one of our listeners is wondering if you have any assessment on how much of percentage within today's Afghan population actually does support the Taliban.
Well, it is difficult actually to give you a figure or throw a figure without a survey, which of course is beyond my capacity to do something like that. But all I can say, based on the assessments that we have had prior to the collapse of the Afghan government, when I served in the Afghan government, was that the public had withdrew their support, but it was difficult to say because, I mean, it's a long range to what extent the public can withdraw their support from the central government based on the grievances. And it has been very divided. I mean, the grievances has been very diverse. But again, as I mentioned that in my previous comment, that they did not choose the Taliban by default just because they didn't want the central government. And we haven't had a third option for the Afghan people. They have been looking for a third option and we haven't had it. And when I'm talking about the grievances with the government, I don't mean the grievances with the structures of the regime, which was aligned with the democratic values. I mean the people in that administration or how they govern the government. So yes, it has been partially the grievances, but it's so difficult to say how many people are supporting. As I mentioned, they're survivors. As far as the Taliban are not killing them, the bar is so low, actually. They're happy with their lives. So yeah, so it's difficult for me to throw a number, but all I can say is that the common Afghan population, apart from the Taliban members and their families, the common Afghan population are not supporting them. But yes, they are also not standing up against them with arms and weapons because they don't have a leadership. Yes, the Northern resistance is out there and generating the support. And then we have other armed resistance groups against them. And then we have women's civic movement, but the leadership is not as strong as the people can stand behind them. So that's also why they're not standing up against them, but it doesn't mean that they're supporting them.
Okay, Ms. Düring, you have already addressed a few questions of the chat. Thank you for making my job easier. Still some remain, for example. Could Germany, by engaging directly with the Taliban, not have more leverage to push for the protection of women's rights, minority rights, and other human rights concerns, using its position to advocate for positive change?
Well, I tried to answer that briefly beforehand, and as I've already seen the Minty survey or Zoom survey. I do not think that this is possible. I think this is a naive idea that we would be able to do so. If we look at what the Taliban did over the past months, then they made promises and they did not keep these promises. Well, let's take the example of women and girls and their education. At the beginning, they said, of course, yes. And then suddenly it was no longer possible. They said women would be allowed to work. And then they weren't. So I would like it to work. But in the current situation, we do see that direct cooperation with this de facto government would actually legitimize this government. And Ms. Jalil has already mentioned it earlier. I think we have to be very careful what this legitimization would mean eventually. So I would still be in favor of a decentralized negotiation with different groups who are fighting for an improvement of the lives of the people on the ground, but that we do not fall into the trap to think that the Taliban are the solution for the current situation. We have to be clear what an acknowledgement or legitimization would mean on the ground.
All right. The next question is directed to Mr. Strand and to Ms. Jalil. So I would ask first Ms. Jalil and then Mr. Strand to answer, also including what Ms. Düring just said about the legitimization of the Taliban's regime. What is the Taliban's power base? And is there a way of cooperating with the population without increasing the Taliban's power base? And if yes, how specifically?
Okay, so what is the Taliban's power base? Fear. The Taliban is ruling the population with fear. They don't have the power basis is not the local legitimacy or the legitimacy from the general public, but then also another, I would say, aspect of it is, again, the lack of options on the ground to replace the Taliban. How the international community can engage with it, was that the question, if I'm not wrong? How they can engage in Afghanistan without increasing their power or adding to their power. Let's accept the reality that the Taliban has got control of the country now. I mean, that's the reality on the ground. The international community's engagement with the Taliban, it is so difficult to bypass them at this point in time. So that is also reality. Minimizing that engagement, I think that's the ideal, practically ideal situation. But then at the same time, making sure that the money, the channelization of the fund in Afghanistan, that is with the minimum interference of the Taliban, particularly when it comes to engagement of the locals, as Mr. Strand mentioned that, and Mr. Düring as well mentioned that we need to cooperate with the already established platforms in Afghanistan. And Mr. Strand mentioned about the rural areas in Afghanistan. So the platforms that we used to have in Afghanistan, which were not owned by the government, not owned by the international community, but then led and owned by the public, like the community development councils, where we had all the people from the rural areas, engaging those platforms where you can establish a local partnership that helps us actually to informally establish that accountability, but at the same time, minimize Taliban's access to the humanitarian fund, but then at the same time, minimizing Taliban's engagement. It's so difficult to bypass them. It's so difficult to avoid the entire engagement, but yes. If I've got the question right, it helps us to minimize their engagement, and that is a source of support that they used to use in their favor. For example, they used to use the humanitarian aid in Afghanistan for the last 20 years, giving the permission. They used to use that as at their advantage, giving the permission to distribute food, which was stamped by USAID or any other humanitarian organization. So yes, they're trying to find ways in order to build their legitimacy among the local population through different ways. But as far as we try to minimize it, I think that is how we can help with the situation.
If I should follow up on that, I think we need to keep in mind that it wasn't just by 2021 that Taliban captured Afghanistan. They had effectively controlled large, maybe more than 50-60% of Afghanistan rural areas from 2015, 2016. And so there is a kind of governance structure that they already had put in place. Their governance structure today, except for the Ministry of Women Affairs and the Human Rights Commission, is exactly the same. So there was this curious thing about them upholding some of the same structures with some of the same staff that have worked through different administrations. So just to be into that, but power base is, I would phrase it in a different way. The power base is in those that benefit from security at the moment, and it doesn't imply that they support the Taliban. But after 40 years of war, it has been at least a bit of security in some parts of the country. And the NGOs who might have to pay for the Taliban, I've interviewed a lot of them, they had to pay even more for the government to be allowed to work in Taliban-controlled areas. So it's some of these things that people have seen and also are then concerned about their future. But I'd just like to pick up, because I think part of the solution is actually in direct communication and direct dialogue and direct support with the communities. And the community development councils, well, that could be one option if they have developed, if they have actually been representative of the local communities. And some are not. I've done an evaluation of this, and I can recommend the reading of it, because those NGOs that really worked with the communities, respected the communities, they were extremely strong community organization around. That goes all over Afghanistan. Engage with them, allow them to make decisions, and Taliban will have to listen to them, as the government had to do before, because they are strong, they have strong support locally. But again, build Afghanistan from below. The common Afghans living in rural urban areas, they need to be empowered, to use that term. That's what they have felt disempowered over the last 40 years. Give them a voice.
May I intervene here, please?
Yes, please.
Just a correction. Taliban has never controlled Afghanistan 50 to 60%. I mean, in the last 20 years, my figures are way too different than that. Yes, we have had congested areas, but they have never controlled that number of territory, actually. And the second aspect of it is when it comes to the Taliban's governance, Taliban has never been able to govern, to offer, I even have a disagreement with the shadow government, using that term for the Taliban. The Taliban is way too different. That was a term that can be used for Hezbollah, because they are offering services to the people as well, but not to the Taliban. So the Taliban, yes, they did have the structures and how they reestablished their old structure in terms of the commissions, in terms of the, I would say, governance structures among themselves. Yes, they started with the commissions that could generate money for them, but they have never been able to build a road or to build a school or provide any sort of services except for the rough and ready justice. So they haven't been able to offer the alternative services that the government was services. So that's why it's so difficult to say that the Taliban had established a governance system in the local areas. And I even have an issue with the shadow governance term that was used to the Taliban. No, they have not been able to do that. And they have never controlled actually 50 to 60% of the territory. Control is not.
Can I just correct, because I'm using figures from SIGAR and I'm talking about the period from 2015 onwards. And it was not the cities, but it was the rural areas.
All right. Thank you for the correction, Mr. Strand and Ms. Jalil, and for the useful insights. I have one question to Ms. Düring left, which is, If shared values seem to be a condition for development cooperation for you, why is development cooperation happening in other autocratic countries, or at least countries with a difficult gender laws, for example, Uganda? What is the difference between those and Afghanistan for you, and where can you draw the red line?
Ich glaube, das ist ehrlich gesagt einer der Punkte, die man immer wieder verhandelt.
Well, I think that this is one of the things that you always have to negotiate. When do we cross the red line? And for up until when do you still have this interaction? But I think we have to distinguish between humanitarian aid, the objective of which predominantly is to help, irrespective of who it is, and development cooperation, which exactly, or which in fact requires certain values as a background. So as long as you can communicate and as long as you can interact with each other and know that there is a basic understanding of certain values like human rights, I think as long as this is given, you can and should talk with each other. However, I do not see this with the Taliban at the moment, so there is not this common basis. And of course, we could have a separate event on that. When do we cross this red line that I mentioned, and when development cooperation should actually be stopped at the bilateral level? And I think this is actually a distinction that we have to make clear also with regard to Afghanistan and other countries. There is a development cooperation, bilateral development cooperation close to the government, and there is also the other development cooperation, which is not affiliated with the government. And I would actually say that in many areas, this development cooperation, which is not connected to the government, would actually support much more what we understand when we say feminist development cooperation, in order to provide equal access and to empower people. I could go on, but I know that we are running out of time.
Yeah, thank you for taking that into account. And we are also looking forward to the event discussing the red line. Yeah, great thanks to the audience and to all the panelists for answering all the questions. And with that, I hand back over to Anastasia and Yanis.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see me well. There seems to be something wrong with my camera. Anyway, we're already at the end of the event, and we would like to thank our guests again for the discussion and for answering the questions of the audience. We also want to thank all of you for your questions and participation, the HBS and the SLE for enabling us to discuss this topic publicly, and the entire team behind the event. I also want to highlight that we are preparing an info paper with up-to-date background information about German development cooperation in Afghanistan. We have also prepared a short evaluation, so please take some minutes to answer the questions and also leave your contact information in the evaluation form if you are interested in receiving the paper. Thank you all very much and have a nice evening.
Thank you also from my side. We really hope that you enjoyed our discussion.